All right, and now it's time. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to see our international audience on this webinar today. So we are starting our live webinar session, 5 survey mistakes that can ruin your research results and how to avoid them. We all know conducting online surveys is one of the most powerful ways to really explore market trends, collect customer feedback, employee feedback, validate business ideas, but there are some critical mistakes that we definitely want to make sure you're avoiding so you could get the most out of your surveys. I'm really excited to see you all at this session today as our experts will go in exactly those mistakes and how to avoid them. My name is Natasha Safronova, and I'm a marketing strategist and head of product marketing at SoGoSurvey, a company that is on a mission to build the world's best feedback platform to power smartest world decisions. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm moderating the session, and I am going to introduce our speakers today. Ross Rubin is the founder and principal analyst at Radical Research. Hello, Ross.
Hi, Natasha. I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, Ross. And Melissa Kratt is my colleague here at SoGoSurvey. She's our VP of Success. Hello, Melissa.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to see some familiar names and not exactly faces, but hello to everyone. Very happy to be here today.
Fantastic. All right, so before we begin, just because we really have this large audience today, I want to make sure that we go over a few housekeeping details just so everybody has the best webinar experience possible. It looks like we have already tested video and audio. Thank you for our audience for being so engaged. Also, as you may have already noticed, all attendees are muted by default. But if you have a question or a comment at any time during this presentation, please use chat or Q&A tool, send those questions in. The Q&A widget is at the bottom of your screen. I'll make sure to bring it up with our presenters as fits, or we will also have the dedicated Q&A time at the end of this webinar. We have 60 minutes for this webinar today, about 45 minutes of moderated conversation, and then about 15 minutes at the end for all the questions you may have. Also, the session will be recorded, so you will receive the recording tomorrow in the email. And just before we begin, also to emphasize that we definitely would love to hear your questions, but also any comments, any feedback, anything you would like to share, anything you would like to discuss, please feel free. We want the session to be as helpful, useful, interactive as possible. And with that, let's get started. All right, so today's conversation, really quick. This is what we're going to go over today. How survey design impacts participation and results. Some question design mistakes you want to avoid and how to do that. How to ensure that your reports deliver meaning and value. And finally, features that boost engagement and data quality in your surveys. And what we wanted to do today is actually a quick poll here to all of you. So I'm going to launch it on my screen, and you should be able to see it on your screen now as well. So what are your biggest survey challenges, just so we understand better and could make sure that the webinar content is catered to your needs? This is a multi-choice question, so you could choose as many as apply. I see all the responses are coming. So again, thank you for being, wow, responses are really coming. This is exciting. I see a leader. Oh, you all will be okay. Now I'm really excited to see the results, but to share the results with everybody. Just a few more seconds, almost 100% participation. That's super exciting. But a few more people who did not answer the question yet, you have a few more seconds. And I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you for all your answers. All right, now you're able to see the results, hopefully. Melissa, what do you think?
I will just act surprised if this is a good place to start. I think The fact that we made this, of course, a multi-select question is why we're having this conversation today. Of course, we know there are many points at which people can be challenged in the design, development, distribution, reporting, analysis. I'm a little surprised that on that first one, that seems a little bit low to me sometimes. In terms of biggest survey challenges, if you have a none of the above, you can obviously drop it into the chat. We love to hear, but these are some of the most common that we hear in conversations with our clients. So definitely that getting enough responses, no shocker there, but I'm happy to see that people are having not too many issues in terms of distributing and sort of getting the technical pieces set up. But awesome, good start, sets us up well. So let us start with that design piece, because very frequently, of course, we are doing these projects, we're doing these research projects to get some sort of information, to be able to make a decision. And if we don't have enough responses, it becomes difficult to make decisions based on that data. Of course, however, where that all starts is in the design process. So sometimes we think about the design process as from the moment that someone thinks, aha, we should find out the answer to this question. Sometimes people think it starts when I start writing the questions. I mean, both of these are correct. Of course, we know really we're getting into that point today, talking about what impact does design have. There are a lot of different stages in the process we could talk about, but really today we're talking about design because it has a huge impact on participation, which has to do with response rates, and also the quality and value of the results, which is why you're doing this project in the first place. And I would just say thank you to all of you joining, because what happens very frequently in my role is I talk with a lot of clients who haven't spent the time sometimes thinking about this in advance. Sometimes they come in a little bit later in the process and say, isn't it weird that no one's responding? And if you look at the survey sometimes and you really start to think about it, there are some of those indicators pretty early on. And that's really the topic of our conversation today. So I'm going to show you this powerful quote here. You and I, all of us, we talk about survey projects, we talk about research, we talk about gathering data. But what we need to keep in mind is there are very few people out there in the universe anxiously awaiting for those surveys to hit their inboxes. Very few people are like super excited about taking surveys. In as much as we're excited about sending them, we have to recognize that the participant experience is the most, you can see I'm excited, I'm using my hands a lot with this. The participant experience is the most important part of this whole thing. If your participants aren't engaged, they're not enthusiastic, they don't see the value, you're not going to have good response rates. So keep in mind that person out there is not necessarily holding their breath. And when we get to the next slide, a few more points to keep in mind. When you want to think about who are those people who want to be participants, are people anxiously waiting? Perhaps they are. Perhaps you do have a very specific target audience in mind. Your audience is a huge determining factor in how can I qualify this purpose? How can I connect most directly to them? It's not the same as who wants to be a millionaire, right? It's a very different kinds of question. So you want to make sure that we're prioritizing their experience. Mandatory questions, forcing people to answer simply means that they won't. A very significant percentage of those conversations that I have where people say, oh, I can't believe they haven't answered all of these questions. We have low response rates. These are a lot of the major reasons because we've made so many of the questions mandatory. We've put in the first place so many questions. It's not necessarily important to ask every single question. It's really thinking about what is most relevant for your audience and your purpose. That point here about spending your capital wisely. Capital can mean any number of different things. When we talk about capital investment, maybe it's your time, maybe it's your energy, it's your resource, it's your actual money, all of that sort of time is money thing. But it's also trust, the trust that you have with your audience. You've asked them into this conversation. You're saying your time is valuable. I respect it. It means that you really need to. You cannot burn that trust because what it means is if you disappoint them that first time or you give them, the not quite the experience that they had hoped for, they are not likely to come back. And so these are some pieces to keep in mind as we get into this initial stage. There's huge value in spending extra time on design. I won't say the other parts aren't important, but there's huge value keeping the participant experience in mind, top of mind as you go into the rest of the process. The phases, we might say, of survey design, Ross. Is that a good transition?
That's a great one, Melissa, and thank you so much. Design really does play a role throughout the broader survey process. We're really going to focus on one of those phases today, But the dynamic of it is that the decisions that you make early in the chain really affect the results that you're going to get later in the chain. So as Melissa indicated, one of the most important things you can do, and it may not be very intuitive, is to determine the scope of the survey. And you may be the person making the decision on the scope. You may be deciding, here's the set of issues I want to ask about. Here's how deep I want to go in terms of asking those questions. Here's the breadth of opinions that I want to take into account. Or, as is often the case, you may be working with a group of people, each of whom have different ideas about what should be on the survey. And so sometimes, as a survey designer, you need to have some political skills in order to help the group determine, okay, here's what we're going to focus on for this survey or this round of survey. And maybe there's an opportunity to get at some of these other issues in other surveys. Once you have determined what the scope of the survey is going to be, what types of questions you want to answer, then it is time to develop the questions. And a good idea is to kind of start with a list of topics or subtopics that you want to include, and then actually start drafting the questions. And very often, I find when designing surveys, working with clients, this is an iterative process. So I will come up with a list of questions. I'll send it to the client, ask, what are you thinking about the scope of what we're asking about? What do you think about the answer choices that we're presenting to respondents? And I get feedback and we make adjustments as we go on. Once you have determined what questions and what answer choices you're shooting for, then it is, of course, time to test the survey. You want to make sure that any path that you're sending a respondent down makes sense, is consistent with the answers that they may be giving you. Just like anything you send out into public, you want to make sure that the document that you're sending is clear, that there are no typos, proofreading, that folks have the best opportunity possible to provide you with the information you're seeking. And the testing phase is super important because once you're done with that, then it's time to field. And once you have a survey in the field, you are letting it out into the world. And very often what you'll find when working with certain survey tools is that you are very limited in terms of the kinds of changes you can make once you expose a survey to respondents. And the reason for that, there's a good reason, is because if the changes you make are too drastic, you're going to create inconsistencies between groups of respondents. The kinds of answers that the earlier group of respondents gave with one phrasing of a question may not be applicable to include with the results from another set of applicants after they've seen the changes to the question. So this is why testing is really so important, because it's really your last opportunity to make sure that the questions you've developed to address the scope that you've developed is really hitting the mark. Once the survey is fielded, of course, there's a tremendous amount of work that happens after that in terms of getting the data back, analyzing the data, crafting a story, developing a narrative, determining what the course of action is, and then very often that's going to lead to more research. But today we're going to focus on kind of the early part of that chain, in particular, developing the questions. So one more point to make. Very often when you're developing the survey, you're going to do that in a word processor because it's easy, it's familiar, it's easy to get feedback if you're using something like Google Docs. But it's important to remember that online surveys are more than just lists of questions. And there are lots of capabilities that the questionnaire design modules in survey tools like SoGoSurvey can help to streamline the process. So with that, let's move forward and start talking about some question design mistakes to avoid. First off, you're going to want to minimize assumptions about the respondents. You don't want to assume that they have, unless you know in advance, a certain level of knowledge about the topic that you're asking about. If there is any ambiguity, you're going to want to minimize the potential for interpretation by defining terms that may not be common as carefully and consistently as you can. Something that we often see crop up is that you may have a definition in mind of a term and put it on a survey, and the respondent may have a completely different, although equally valid, interpretation of that term. So if you want a respondent to think about a term in a certain way, it's important to add a clause to the effect of defined this way, so that they're clear about the meaning that you're intending. I do a lot of work with panels. When you're working with panels, very often you'll ask for certain kinds of demographic characteristics. I want this many men in the panel between the ages of 18 and 34, or this many women with a household income in this range. And the company that you're working with to provide the data will say, yes, we have met those criteria. It's usually a good idea to trust them, but verify. Ask those questions anyway, if you can, just to make sure that what you're being delivered corresponds with what you actually want. And as I mentioned, survey tools have a lot of capabilities to do things like capture responses that respondents have made earlier in a questionnaire and use them later in the survey. So for example, I just recently completed a survey where I asked consumers what types of technology that they have in the home. And based on that, asked them different kinds of questions. So I asked, for example, about whether you have a tablet. And then I wanted to ask how they use their tablet. So instead of asking them, do you have a tablet? And if so, is this how you use it? I already know because I asked them. It's kind of like if you go through voicemail systems and they ask you for your account number and you give them your account number, and then you finally get to the customer rep, and what's the first thing they ask you? What's your account number? That's frustrating, right? So you want to save the respondents time. You want to show them that you're as engaged with them as you want them to be engaged with you. Let's move on. All right. With that said, we're going to get underway with 5 different types of questions, and we're going to troubleshoot them a little bit live and see what kind of changes we might make to them. So I just talked about a survey that I fielded. This is the kind of question that might have been on that survey. Which of the following do you plan to buy in the next 3 years? And I've got a couple of tech products here. I've got a VR headset, a smartphone, electric car. This is a multi-select question. And, it's good to ask about these kinds of things. But there are a couple of issues. First of all, let's think about that time frame, the next 3 years. In technology in particular, that is a pretty long time. A lot can change in 3 years. And another potential issue is that we are kind of mixing and matching products that have been in the market for a decade or more, such as a smartphone, and something like a VR headset, which is still a pretty emerging technology category. Certainly, there are people out there who have them, but we're likely going to see a lot of changes in that category in the next few years in terms of the price and performance that these products deliver. So let's look at some ways that we might be able to fix or improve this question. All right, so one of the things we might be able to do is to narrow the time frame of the question. Consumers are somewhat notorious for not being able to reliably, or people, I should say, are notorious for not being able to reliably predict their behavior. And of course, the further out you go, the more difficult it is. So for example, if we were asking this question, we were thinking about, say, the holiday season, the Christmas season, we might ask, probably be a good idea to field it around September and ask, what are you planning to buy in the next 3 months? Because not only does the technology tend to stay more stable, but things like people's income situation is likely to be a lot more stable in the next 3 months than in the next 3 years. Melissa, you want to chime in with some other things we might try here?
Yeah, I think this goes back to your same point previously about assumptions. Like if you call me on my smartphone to ask, I mean, like there's a lot of different moving parts here. Talk to me with my watch and my phone. This definitely, like the assumptions that we can make about me with my phone. I thought my phone was going to be good for the rest of the year. I wasn't planning to buy, but now I just found out, I need 5G, so I need a different phone. Well, in 3 years, it'll probably be 15G for all I know as well too. So we have a notoriously difficult time, like you said, predicting even what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, let alone in 3 years. So I absolutely agree. Keeping the constraints tight and having the grouping the categories together. These are very different kinds of things, like a smartphone and a VR headset. Obviously they could be connected to each other, but they're very different buckets. So I think sometimes even categorizing them in more similar buckets is helpful. But yeah, stop making assumptions. That's the biggest one.
Another thing you may want to consider when you're looking at things into which you may have limited visibility, and this goes into the accuracy versus precision trade-off that we'll talk a little bit more about later, is if you're asking about a lot of phenomena where you don't yet have a clear picture of how it's going to shake out, and things that are new to consumers or a panel, you may ask about, instead of asking intent, well, I don't even really know what this thing is yet, so I'm not really in a position to say whether I'm going to buy it. But maybe ask about awareness. What level of awareness do you have around a particular product, or perhaps some legislation, that's being proposed before you're going to ask people, are you in favor of it or do you oppose it? I didn't even know that thing existed. So once you know if someone's aware of it or how comfortable they are with it, then maybe you have a follow-up question that asks, okay, you said you're aware of it. We're going to trust you on this one. Given that, how do you feel about it? So, all right, let's move on to the next question. All right, we talked about clear definitions, and this seems to be a pretty innocuous question. Which of the following sports do you play regularly? This is another choose all that apply. We've got four different sports and a none of the above. And this really has, again, two kinds of issues. Somewhat similar to the intent question, we have this term regularly. Well, what's regularly to me may not be regularly to you. Maybe I play baseball 3 times a week during the summer, but of course, once it gets colder out, I don't play it at all. I switch to an indoor sport, maybe like basketball. And of course, as Natasha mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have a very international audience here today. And so if I know that this survey is being fielded within the United States only, I'm probably okay including football as something that describes a game with an oblong ball and big field goal posts and guys running around using their hands a lot. Of course, outside the United States, that would have a different definition. So if we wanted to ask about both of those sports, there are a couple of things we could do. So why don't we look at how we might address some of the issues in this question. One of the ways might be to replace regularly with a clearer time definition, at least once per month, at least twice per week, to give people less ambiguity in terms of the time frame that they're thinking about. We could change football to soccer, or if it's outside the US, we could include American style football, or we could even get really fancy and put in a filter on the question so that if the respondent has indicated they're in the United States, we use the terms football and soccer. And if they are outside the United States, we use American football and football. Melissa, any other thoughts on
I'm
this
not
one?
going to weigh in on which is the real football, the one
Oh,
that
soccer.
you refer to.
Well, what we call soccer is the real football.
Very controversial term. It's funny, like it's a funny example that we're using here today, but these kinds of things are, really sort of rife with opportunity. The idea that engagement or satisfaction, a lot of those kinds of words that we use just sort of flippantly, but it means a lot when we're interpreting the results. So the regularly, what is the term football? Even the point that you made earlier too about seasonality. Maybe I'm asking these questions in the spring or in the whatever. And then what is spring, right? So if it's going with that global audience as well too, everyone knows what spring is. It's these months. Well, those months might be different for me than for you as well. So the more specific you can be sometimes, the more complex it can be. And it goes back to that same idea of logic, of pre-population, some of those good sort of tech features, because it's not a piece of paper, right? It's not in the word processor, it is text. So you do have some options there to back yourself up rather than if you have ever been, like you don't need to have too many ifs. Just moving forward with that tech backup is definitely really helpful on this one.
Yeah, good point. Just because you're trying to collect the same kind of information from everyone on a survey doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to get the same question. So let's move on. Okay, so I mentioned this classic trade-off in research, the trade-off between accuracy and precision. And some people may look at this and say, aren't those the same things? But they are not in the world of research. So precision is the degree of specificity at which you're capturing data. So if I ask you what is the value of the number pi, and you tell me about 3, that is an answer that is fairly accurate. But if you calculate pi to 100 digits, that is an answer that is far more precise. If you tell me that the definition of pi is 136 point, 100 digits, that is an answer that is also very precise because it has a great degree of granularity, but it is not very accurate. So that is the trade-off that we must often make between accuracy and precision. So let's take a look at how that might come into play. I'm doing some research on streaming usage, and I want to ask folks, how many minutes did you spend watching streaming shows last week? And I want to know down to the minute. I want a very precise answer. So I just asked them to fill it in. Now, some of the issues here are that the respondents are unlikely to produce an accurate account of the number of minutes. They may provide a very precise amount. They may say 37.6 minutes. That's how many minutes I watch. That's pretty precise, but it may not be very accurate. And so, Melissa, why don't we talk about some of the ways that we could make that trade-off between accuracy and precision here for a better result?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think this is a great one. It's a great example because we know we want real information. We want the right answers, but it's very unlikely. Like I personally do not track numbers by minutes. Like it would be alarming if I found out what that number was. But in most cases where we're looking for this kind of a result, we want to be able to look at a report in terms of ranges, in terms of brackets, chunk. So this is very common for age range, for example, or income range. If you ask, how much money does this household make in a year? Again, it's really, you're probably looking for information because you're looking to segment your population. You're looking to segment your groups into different slices or different chunks, if you like. So the range, how many hours, is a little bit more likely to be more accurate. It's slightly less precise, but it's more accurate. 2 to 3 hours, let's say, for example, versus 37.5 minutes. Behavioral data can be more useful, of course, as well, too. And I would just add from the tech perspective as well, too, if you are looking actually for information within a specific range, make sure it's set as a specific field if you absolutely need that number, that exact precise number, and set that expected range as well, too. Because if you expect, if you say what percentage of time, for example, and you leave it wide open, they could put anything in there. But if you expect, well, it has to be 0 to 100, for example. So you've got a lot of different pieces here. So thinking about too, the kind of information that you're collecting, how you actually want to use it. Is it absolutely critical? For example, birth date is another one. We see a lot of people fill in birth date. Well, I'm not going to make decisions based on everyone who was born on September 16th. This is what we think about you, or this is born in a certain year, for example. And so the idea of grouping them into brackets because you're looking at the behavior of that group or something like that, you've got a little bit more leeway there.
I saw a question that we were actually going to address, so I'll chime in on it. The question is, what is behavioral data? So survey data is often referred to as reported data. You're asking respondents something and they tell you to the best, hopefully to the best of their ability, as honestly as they can, what they've done. That's in contrast to behavioral data, where you're actually tracking what somebody does. So, for example, if let's say I work at Hulu or Netflix or Disney Plus, I know how many minutes a certain subscriber has watched my programming, because it's just recorded as I serve the stream. So I don't have to actually ask the consumer. I may need to ask them what they thought of it, but I don't need to ask them how many minutes were consumed, because I have that from my data logs. Web traffic, another great example of behavioral data. So you know, it's often can deliver a high degree of precision and accuracy if it's obtainable, but unfortunately, it's not always obtainable. In many cases, it's not obtainable, and there are different kinds of privacy laws that apply to collecting behavioral data as well. So why don't we move to the next one? Okay, so we're going to ask, as we get toward the end of this, it seems fitting to ask about desserts. Which desserts do you enjoy? We've got some fine answers there, as well as none of the above, or as it's often called in the survey world, nota. Well, this one's a little bit of a trick question, because there's really nothing wrong with this survey, with this question. As it stands. Actually, as I look at it, it would have been a good idea to specify that it was a multiple choice question in the question. But beyond that, there's nothing really wrong with it per se. The issue comes in the implementation. Very often we see questions like this, multi-select questions with a none of the above option. And when the respondent clicks none of the above, they are still able to select some of the other options. So you'll see results come in like, I like ice cream cake and none of the above. So obviously it's very difficult to analyze that kind of data, because you're not quite sure what was meant by that. So the good news is that there are a lot of built-in ways to avoid this kind of situation. So why don't we show that? Depending on the tool you're using, again, we were talking about the difference between a list of questions and using a questionnaire design tool. Most of the better design tools, or more sophisticated questionnaire design tools on the market, will treat none of the above as a special option. And so if you put it in a question, it's going to know to automatically dim the other responses. Another thing, by the way, that I've seen vary in different survey tools is that some will allow you to put none of the above in the middle of the answer choices. So that can be a little confusing as well. Do you mean none of the above, but some of the ones below are okay? Melissa, I believe that
I have a lot to
SoGoSurvey. Yeah, why don't you talk about how you guys handle this one?
I love the feedback that cheese is not an option. Yes, it is not an exhaustive list, which we'll come back to.
Yes, we will talk about that.
We'll come about that one as well.
Because it always comes back to cheese.
So. Cheese is always a critical stands alone for sure. So none of the above. I think there are a couple of things. One of the things you mentioned, of course, how does this work in the tool that you're using? Of course, in SoGo, it's a separate type of answer. you have the whole list, and then this is at the bottom. You can choose this or you can choose other. They function differently. They deselect the preceding answers, even if you thought, cake, well, sort of just a placeholder, for example. The other thing that you mentioned too is how are we phrasing this question? In this case, is it a mandatory question? You better have a none of the above. It's a mandatory question. Our preceding question in our poll, for example, if none of those things applied to you, you wouldn't have had to select anything. So which desserts, plural, for example, I'm prompting you that it's multi-select. If I'm giving you that caveat, if any, for example, that kind of thing. So the phrasing of the question itself is also very helpful. It needs to match the actual question type, but the phrasing of the question stem itself. But yeah, that's the worst. What kind do you like? Fruit and nothing. Okay, great. Yeah, good, useful results that it looks fine, again, on paper, but when you have the technology, use the technology to improve your results.
All right, let's move on. All right, so I believe this is our fifth example. We're going to move on from multi-select questions and look at a single select answer question where you can only choose one. And the question is, what is your employment status? This one comes up a lot on surveys. We've got three options here: full-time employee, part-time employee, and unemployed. And so we're going to use this question to talk about another concept that comes up a lot in survey design that's called MISI. And MISI stands for mutually exclusive, which means that you shouldn't have answers that overlap. And so, I can't be both a full-time employee and unemployed, right? So that's good. Those two options are mutually exclusive. And then the CE part of it stands for collectively exhaustive. So that means if I'm answering a single select question, I want to make sure that the choices that I provide cover the complete range of options or possibilities that exist. So how good a job have I done that here in this question? Not a great job. Maybe this would have worked pretty well 50, 60 years ago, but there are many more. No, it's CE for collectively. Sorry, not selectively exhaustive. Completely. Collectively exhaustive. In any case, so there are a lot of different kinds of working relationships these days. So why don't we advance the slide and look at some other things we might add here. So a few things that we might add are retired, self-employed, contractor, freelancer, and so you may respond, well, what if I only care about unemployed people, in my survey? Why should I even bother with all these answers? All I care about is if they're unemployed. Well, the answer is there's two answers. One, again, it comes back to the idea of making respondents feel comfortable and that you're capturing their input, right? Which is pretty much the whole proposition of a survey. And also showing that, you're acknowledging a number of different options out there. Also, it may turn out later in doing your analysis, hey, I should be asking about folks who are contractors as well. Sometimes it's good to plan ahead a little bit, even if you don't know specifically you're going to need an option when there's little incremental cost to doing so in terms of adding an answer. And then, Melissa, maybe you can talk about, in this example of contractor and freelancer, those, I might want to combine those responses later on. So how might we do that?
Exactly. So yeah, I think it's as we said earlier, like who knows what the future of virtual reality is, like who knows what the future of employment is either too. So full-time, part-time, unemployed could have been very, very useful at a specific time. But now we might have, like you said, maybe this is a group that we only care about a specific type, a specific track. What that means sometimes is, okay, well, let's consider contractors and freelancers to be in the same sort of bucket for analysis purposes, or retired and unemployed, those need to be apart. Or in some cases, maybe they belong together because those are people who are not part of that job force that you're considering in your analysis. So I think a couple things here. One of them is if you only care about people who are in a certain group, stop talking to everybody else. Don't waste people's time, right? So branching, that logic of getting that. If they have multiple jobs, it's a good point. It could be a multi-select question as well too. So we see a lot of trends toward multi-select, which is really empowering for a lot of different people who prefer to be described in different ways and not just put in one little bucket. We see this one with a lot of race or ethnicity or these kinds of questions too, where people do fit into multiple categories and it's totally appropriate. On the analysis side though too, merging those answer sets can be very, very helpful. So in addition to like I do it on a rating scale, like I can see how many people chose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I can also put 1 and 2, 4 and 5 together. It makes it easier to analyze. So you get those sort of in-depth level of like specificity, that again, that accuracy or precision. Do you want the specific or do you want the bigger bucket? And it has to do with how you want to report on them. I agree, side hustle would be a good one.
That would be a good one. All right, let's move on. All right, well, we promised you 5, but we're going to throw in a bonus question here called mixing and matching. Our question for you is, which best describes how you feel when 5 mistakes become 6? Now I'm asking which best describes it. So if one of these doesn't completely nail down how you're feeling, just tell me which one comes closest. And of course, the problem is that the 2 options may include contradictory terms. So satisfied but angry versus happy but disappointed. I mean, both of those are certainly an interesting mix of feelings, but I may feel one without necessarily feeling the other. In fact, I just saw a question and answer somewhat similar to this, exhibiting this kind of issue in a major national newspaper, asking about how people taking the survey felt about 2 issues that they conflated, and how do you feel about this and that? And they sort of assumed that they were related or the same thing, or that if I supported one, I would support the other. But that's not necessarily true. As it turns out, I supported one, but not the other. So how can we fix this? Well, actually, I mean, this one's a pretty simple fix. We can change it to a multi-select kind of question, and we can include satisfied, angry, happy, disappointed as separate choices. We can allow the respondent to select multiple ones, and that would be a way of capturing that mix of feeling, I'm happy, but I'm also a little angry. So
I hope no one feels that way. I hope no one's like, oh no, I can't believe you screwed up this number, counting to 5. This is a really big one. And for any of you who have studied rhetoric, logic, all of these fallacies, right? Like the double-barreled question, like, what are you actually answering? Mixing matching is the most accessible way to call this, but we see this a lot of time where it's really, really hard to be able to figure out, what's going on in terms of the answers. I hope that you are all satisfied, right? Of course, sort of thing too.
Satisfied and happy.
Satisfied and happy is what we would like to have you select, but that same thing of that answer constraints. If you have a long list, if you're not really sure, help people focus their feedback so you're narrowing it down rather than giving them all of the options, in which case they've selected 4 different things here potentially, and it doesn't help you use that information, of course, to make decisions. So I know we're going into just the last few things here. I know many of you have questions, and Tasha, I know that you popped up to let us know. A lot of people have questions, and we're getting
right. Yes, exactly. I just unmuted myself to thank you all our attendees for being engaged, for asking all those questions, for leaving their comments. That's really great to see. We will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar, but if we are not able to take a question, we will make sure to respond to you offline. So that's just my little remark.
Very good. So we just have a few things. So obviously we've talked a little bit about why do we care about this stuff, the specific stuff that we care about, and why do we do it? So if you take a look at this, we've mentioned it we've mentioned it several times. So if you take a look on the next slide here, don't let these reports happen to you. This is the worst kind of report to end up with. That kind of information that you have, 5 mistakes become 6. If you have 2 answer sets, how can you ever analyze that? In the top right, how many minutes? well, useless information. Who actually knows that it was 67 minutes? Like, I'm not doubting you. You could have a tracker. You could do whatever you want to do. Kind of weird and not a useful report. This is really unfortunate to see text boxes when people expect to have a bar graph. And the bottom one on the left, the employment status. The other one that we see just at a glance, you can see other. If you can't figure out the right categories, that other is overwhelming. 67% of respondents chose something other than what you had in mind. That's totally possible. In our example, we've thought of several things, not to mention side hustle. There are a lot of different things that we could add to that list. The more exhaustive your list, the less useless this last pile is in this other. So a couple things that we've mentioned reports throughout. The other piece that we have here is that something else that we put in, we've mentioned multiple times too. So in the next section, just another slide here, work it. Put those features to work for you. We've mentioned it several different times. Using the right question type is huge. Setting it as mandatory or not is huge. Use the preview, test it out, check it out yourself, whether you're using a preview link, a test link. You don't want to be testing it with your actual participants. You want to be testing, I've seen some questions about this, with your, test it yourself. The way that it works for you is probably the way that it's going to work for your participants. When you see this, we see this a lot of time, people choosing check boxes instead of radio button questions. If you test it, you will see, oh, I can check several of these. That's fine if that's what you want. But if you have a rating question or a radio button question, you should not be asking people to check multiple boxes to give just one single answer. Be very careful with question type. It's super powerful. It gives you a lot of information, but it can also, unfortunately, lead you down the wrong track. The second one, pre-population. And the top right, I have, which department did you connect with? If I am reaching out to you after you've connected with my team, there's a pretty good chance I know which team you connected with. Don't ask people questions that you already know the answers to. We already talked about building that relationship, showing that trust. Ross's example of your customer number, your account number, for example. Why am I going to ask you the same stuff that I already know? I'm not going to say, Ross, what's your name again? It's disrespectful, it's disengaging, it's disconnecting. Fill it in, move them along, set logic based on it. The next one there too. If I'm going to ask you if you had a negative experience, I ask you the follow-up, how could it be improved? You know what, maybe I want to know the same thing if you were very satisfied because I'm an overachiever, for example, but customize the question so it's conversational, it's adaptive. When you have a real conversation with a real person, they respond in kind. They show that engagement in that conversation. It's not like a robot is just receiving it. You have the technology, so use it. One more thing to put in there, piping as well too. We see this commonly in mail merge, for example, is a common way to think of this technology as well. I know something about you. I'm going to fill it in to prompt you. Hi, Melissa. How was your experience with the training team? Using that same using that same sort of trick, not just in the content of an email invitation, but also in the survey itself. Customize the experience so that you're showing questions that make sense, the right kind of questions. Don't ask questions you already know the answer to, and pre-fill answers that you already know to give that, oh, you attended those sessions? Which sessions did you attend? Oh, these 3? Tell us how you felt about these 3 sessions. I don't need to ask you how you felt about every session if you didn't attend them. It's useless information. I could go on and on and on this slide. I just tried to keep it short to one little slide, but Natasha, I'll flip back over to our poll here as we wrap up and move on to questions. There's not a right answer. Is this a single select or multi-select question on the poll? Everyone wants to know. It's a single select question, which matches which resonated with you the most. 4 different categories we have, so I'll give you a minute here for this poll. There's no right answer. All right. Whenever you're ready, Natasha, anxiously awaiting.
Yes, so the responses are coming. I just want to give.
I'm anxious, that's all.
Okay, yeah.
So this is like having a real life in the field.
70% of our attendees responded. So I want another 30, a few more seconds, and I'm going
You see, this happens in real life, everyone. Everyone has the same experience. Like I had a really good response rate, but I want 100%. Like, okay, great.
All right. I got the clue. I'm going to end polling and share the results.
Excellent. So no surprise, really the focus is on exactly the topic of our conversation today. So we know that those are framing pieces. I'm excited to see high number on features. So anybody who wants to have, of course, there were only 4 points in our structure today. So that's why we stuck with those 4 points. So if you had other feedback, we'd love to hear it from you as well too. But I'm excited to see that feature conversation near and dear to my heart. Although Ross, nice job. It wasn't a competition there, but yeah.
All right, and this brings us to the Q&A section. So yes, really excited, but also we don't have a lot of time. So I already know we won't be able to get to all the questions, but please let that not stop you from asking your question, leaving your comment, because we will do our best and we'll make sure to respond to you offline as well after the webinar to continue the conversation. All right, so the first question we've received was, I just want to start with that one. Okay, here. So somebody asked, I am developing survey questions for myself for a website. What issues I should be aware of when doing surveys on my own? Should I start with a prototype before doing mainstream?
Go ahead, Ross.
Without knowing too much about the specifics of what you're trying to get at, it sounds like a good idea to prototype something first, maybe with a small group of users, see what kind of response you get, see if the answers make sense, and then roll it out to a broader group. I'm guessing that the questions have to do with feedback on the website or the offering on the website. So that is, intercepting or engaging with visitors of your website while they're on your website. Obviously, you want to make sure it's not too intrusive, but in terms of having an opportunity to capture the freshest feedback, that's the best way to do it.
All right, so we've got a lot of actually questions and comments about the response ratio. Somebody asked, what are the expected, or what are the good response ratios? Somebody wants us to do another webinar on how to increase those response ratios. There is also a question, do prices really increase response rate? I'm really tempted to say that it will depend on your audience, but I'll let Ross and Melissa to chime in, of course.
If you're Natasha, you want 100% response rate. That's what we've already learned today.
I would say incentives definitely help with response rate. So to Natasha's point, not everyone has the same incentive. And there are groups that maintain panels of respondents. And a big part of what they do is figure out what the best incentives are. So sometimes it's a gift card. In that case, you may have to think about, is the retailer that you're giving the gift card relevant to the geography, for example, that the respondent is in? Certain types of surveys, a more powerful incentive might be a donation, based on their name, or a chance to win a prize. So it really depends a lot with the group of folks that you're reaching out to.
And I would say too, on that point, the audience is so important in this, because a response rate that's good for a customer group is very different than a response rate that's good for a group of employees who sort of belong to you in some way. You're sort of a captive audience a little bit. You would expect a much higher response rate. I don't even want to say more than 50%, but please, if you can't get 50% of your employees to respond, that's a concern area. But I would say, in addition to incentives, value, when they see the value, if this is about something about me, like my work from home experience or something, if it's something very personal to me and I see that this data is going to be used, that's value as well. That doesn't cost anything. That's not a gift card. It doesn't have to be a prize. If you show me that you have asked me about something important to me, taken my data seriously and acted on it, that pays off now and it pays off in the future, because I'm very likely to respond the next time you ask me something as well.
I mean, another thing that might have value is seeing how your response compares to the aggregate response. I care a lot about that issue.
Yeah,
apparently other people don't. So.
That's a big one. We see it on polls all the time on social media, like, oh, I got my one answer, but what did everybody else say? We care a lot, human animals.
All right, and next question here is, what are the different ways to test a survey before implementing it?
I would just mention from the tech angle really quickly too, like, because as Ross mentioned earlier, once you start to field something, whether it's a pilot, a prototype, whatever you want to call it down the road, test with a test link rather than a live link. A test link is designed in an ideal platform, of course. A test link is going to allow you to be able to practice, see the participant experience without collecting responses. But because when you start collecting responses, that's when it starts to lock down your capabilities in terms of editing. So from the tech point of view, use a test link. But Ross, I'll let you take the bigger picture.
No, from how to do it, that's definitely the way to do it. I'll just chime in on perhaps with whom to do it. A small group of the folks that you're ultimately going to send the survey to, just like in the web example we talked about before, is a good approach. Also, if you're working with a bunch of stakeholders, you want to maybe send them the test links so that they can go through it and say, hey, is this capturing the kinds of things we agreed that this survey should capture? Are there any flaws that you're detecting? Did I make any typos? Include someone who's a pretty good editor is one bit of advice I'd include.
Yeah, that's great. So we, in the essence of time, we are probably going to move on, but I've seen some questions here. Somebody said that they were disappointed that we did not get to the issue of ensuring and know the degree of which we have accomplished the project, or you have accomplished the project with your respondents, in fact, being representative sample of a target population, which I 100% agree. This is very, very important issue. Like just to be able to uncover one of the areas we focus on the questionnaire design today, we definitely are going to continue this webinar series to explore the other areas of the webinar. But I also have great news for everybody, and that is part of our next slide. Actually, not the slide after next slide, but for now, over to you, Ross.
Yeah, just quickly, again, my name is Ross Rubin. My company is Reticle Research. We've recently launched a newsletter called the Reticle Research Report that covers all, if you work in technology, if you are interested in what's happening in big tech, in consumer platforms, VR, a lot of emerging technologies. There will be an option on the feedback form at the end of this to sign up for a free trial subscription to the Reticle Research Report for a couple of months. Just check it, and I would love for you guys to check it out.
Wonderful. Melissa, over to you.
Sure. I wish I could answer every single one of these questions, but I want to tell you, we have a lot of good resources here. Some of the things like the statistical calculator, what makes a representative sample, some of these pieces of feedback on response rates. We do have trainings, we do have webinars, we do have recordings and blogs on a lot of these topics as well too. So I'd invite you to check that out. We will send you directly, of course, the recordings. I'm always happy to see when people are interested in, like, you're taking really good notes, and we really appreciate getting that kind of engagement and feedback. So you get the recording, the slides, you also get a practical guide to survey design. And I'm happy to be able to offer you a free survey questionnaire audit as well too. So get information on that. You can see it here on the slide. I can just tell you, SoGoSurvey is an excellent survey tool / platform. Thanks for the question in the chat here. I don't know if that was a prompt, but definitely a good one. If you have any questions about anything SoGoSurvey related, drop us a note too, and we look forward to working through those audits as well, because we know a lot of these questions are very, very specific to your specific projects, and we'd be happy to talk with you on those one-on-one.
Great, and we are right at time. Again, thank you, huge thank you to our presenters and also to our audience for joining us live today, for being the best engaged audience. We definitely enjoyed seeing all those comments and questions. Again, apologies if we were not able to get to a question live, but we'll make sure to reach out to you and respond offline. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Tomorrow there will be email with recording and all the webinar materials promised here. Thank you and have a fantastic end of the day.